Hi, and welcome to a special edition of PhillyCAM Voices, your community access media news program. My name is Carolyn Davis. I'm a former Philadelphia Inquirer reporter and member of the editorial board, and now I help UN agencies, United Nations agencies, communicate with refugees around the world. And in my spare time, when I'm home, I am a volunteer for PhillyCAM, where I'm learning audio and video skills and work on the Voices news team. Tonight, we have a special presentation with a panel of distinguished journalists. We are going to talk about, we're hoping that this conversation gives you, our viewers, insights into news production and into the relationship between communities and news outlets and the role of community-produced media in Philadelphia. We have with us today, on my immediate left, is Jesenia de Moya Correa. Jesenia is a Spanish bilingual award-winning journalist who covers the Philadelphia region's Latino communities for the Inquirer as one of the Lenfest Fellows. She was born in New York, but grew up in the Dominican Republic. Denis James is an experienced multimedia creator, a teacher, and for nearly 25 years, you might recognize her. She was an on-air TV news reporter for WPVI 6 ABC, and she currently is the communications director of the Philadelphia Police Department, and she also is a PhillyCAM board director. At the end is our token male. Jim MacMillan is a Pulitzer Prize-winning independent journalist. He worked for the Philadelphia Daily News and the Associated Press in Boston and Baghdad, but has more recently focused on local reporting partnerships, including the Reentry Project and Broken Philly. And he will be leading a Solutions Journalism Fellowship at PhillyCAM beginning in February. So a lot of our discussion today is going to focus on ethics and objectivity, journalistic ethics and objectivity and subjectivity. These are all issues that are in the news today, in the news about news. So maybe a good place to start, and maybe Denis will start with you because you're in the middle and I just decided we would start with you. What is your definition of journalistic ethics?
It starts with being honest and open about your connection to whatever you may cover, and honest and open about who you are and what you bring to the table. So my feeling is if you do that, if you own your stuff, if you will, you give the person who is reading or watching or listening to your stories an opportunity to decide how much they think your perspective and your experience impacts what you cover and in what way. Mm-hmm. So I think it's about being honest and open about your approach, who you are and what you bring. Mm-hmm.
And we'll get into some of those issues a bit later. Jim, how about you? What is your definition of journalism ethics?
Well, that's a great start and hard to follow. But one way to expand it would be to look to, and I'm sure we're all familiar with the, a lot of journalists look to the Code of Ethics of the Society of Professional Journalists. Mm-hmm. And at the top, it's very simple. It says, seek the truth and report it. It sounds so simple. And then there are about 50 bullet points explaining how it gets more complicated, how it's necessary to verify your information, to report in context, to avoid stereotyping, and 40 other issues. So for me, it's a matter of kind of trying to go by the book and also balancing that with who you are as an individual.
Jesenia, let me switch gears a little bit, but still on the same general topic. How do you think your values inform your framework and approach to news and journalism? You're a Latina, covering the Latino community. I'm sure there are some tensions or issues that might collide sometimes with that. So how does one inform the other?
Well, the fact that you have the cultural experience of specific Latino community gives you an idea of what a community is all about. But the idea that you can look at your, let's say, education and your understanding of this community in an independent way, you would have to ask yourself if what you think of that community is really it. Mm-hmm. So I put this as a question for myself. When your mother tells you that she loves you, ask her why. And it happens the same among Latinos. Not all Latino sub-communities are equal. Not all Latinos are the same. So me as a Dominican, and I experience something in particular, is that really what other Latinos go through? So that's a way that I take my experience as an American, Dominican American, Dominican York, and I try to ask questions in other spaces, like here in Philadelphia, and I ask Dominican Philadelphians, is this actually how we are? And that's a way that I understand that my value, my cultural understanding, my international perspective is something that I bring to the table, but also something that I myself have to ask myself if it's really part of what I'm supposed to report on.
When you were working on a story, did you ever have an experience where you thought you had it pegged? You thought you knew how the community, the piece of community you were covering or writing about was reacting, or how an issue was framed by being Latino, and you were dead wrong?
Well, definitely. I mean, we recently worked on a piece for the Philadelphia Inquirer regarding the Day of the Dead celebrations, and we have in the U.S. we have this understanding of the Day of the Dead celebration when it's very open, when it's very acknowledged by the Mexican tradition, because we have seen the movie Coco. We more or less understand it from that perspective.
That's a perfectly accurate portrayal, incidentally, isn't it?
Well, it's a good portrayal for the Mexican tradition, but what happens with other Latino communities? In the Caribbean area, rather it's Venezuela, Colombia, or any of the islands, Puerto Rico, Cuba, or Dominican Republic, it's a more sorrow celebration, where people are more intimate about their past loved ones, and it's not necessarily an open celebration, but something that you keep to yourself and you spend with your family. So you have to learn how to present these realities and not necessarily create a stereotype for the Latino communities, because there are various of them.
And can a non-Latino cover Latino communities as well as a Latino? I mean, you could ask that of any group.
Well, that's exactly as you say. You can ask this for any group, and I consider that we can all cover any community as long as we have the empathy to be able to be in this community's reality and their understanding of the world. And this is where social journalism actually takes a new stand in the journalism that we're doing today, because you are part of the community to be able to report about it, and not necessarily the parachute outsider that comes in, reports about it.
You know, I think additionally, there is the notion that I think you have to be willing, in order to cover other communities, and even in the community that you see yourself as from, you have to be willing to say, I may not get that. There are things I'm not going to understand, and that so that you don't wind up in a situation where you feel like, I don't understand it, so it must not be so. It doesn't make sense because I don't get it. And for me, my background is part of what helps me understand just that, that there are things that people don't see in me that they couldn't understand, because if they base it on what they think they see, they could be wrong. And so I think that's really an important thing. And that really gets into privilege, what you see and don't see. And so that's a little bit more complex and it's more nuanced. But for example, with looking at someone and assuming things about them, even like you were talking about with various Latino communities, there may be things that are more in common between Bermuda, Barbados, and Puerto Rico than Puerto Rico and Venezuela.
True, definitely.
Because of different things that make up culture. But you would not know that my grandmother was a German Jew who fled Germany as a young person, or that my grandfather is Native American, African American, or there are things that we look at people, who knows?
Similarly,
who knows?
I'm sorry. I think some people make similar presumptions about me by looking at me that might not be exactly accurate. So I think one way that I come into it is I think it's every journalist's responsibility to figure out how to go into places where they don't belong, where they don't fit in, and figure out how to report.
Yes.
And whether you're from a community or not, it's a different experience. And I think there are advantages and disadvantages. If I'm reporting from a community I don't know as well, perhaps I'm more objective. But obviously, if it's one that I grew up in, I'd be more informed.
Well, this is a good segue to the next question, which is how do you as a journalist navigate your own subjectivity when producing news stories? Jim, do you want to just continue on?
It used to be much easier when I was younger, and I don't know if it's because of maturity, because times have changed, but it's probably both. I used to find it much easier to go by the book and say, these are just the facts. And then you get feedback, but now we get, especially over the last 10 or 15 years, we get so much more feedback from audiences and find out that our presumptions weren't always right on target. So I try to be more attentive to who I am, what I believe, and how it's affecting what I do. So even when trying to operate within the simplest fact reporting rules, I've learned that I think everything we report is affected by the employer we want to work for, the beats we seek, the story, the assignments we want to get, maybe even the cities we choose to live in and work in if we're working locally. So there are lots of factors, and I try to think about how that impacts me more than I did when I was younger.
And of course, it also depends on what kind of journalism you're doing. I was at the Inquirer for 13 years. With most of that, I was on the editorial board, so I could write opinion. I could fight for the things fight and write for the things I believed in, and it was great and freeing. And you can't necessarily, at least the conventional wisdom is you can't do that as a reporter. But I wonder, with the internet, is that changing? I mean, the internet, journalism presented on the internet, via the internet, because of the internet, is really niche interest. You can find your interest. You can, how is the internet changing notions of ethics and objectivity, the need to be that old, what some of us here might consider old classic traditional journalist versus a new journalist? Thoughts, anyone?
Well, it's definitely impacted it because the portal is wider.
Yeah.
And so the portal was through traditional established journalistic outlets. And now you don't even have to hang a shingle, you just need either Wi-Fi or a phone, and that is your portal. So I think that's impacted ethics because it's harder to determine what the ethics are and who is operating in what type of ethical framework.
Right.
So I do think it's impacted that. The other thing, though, it's done on the positive side is widen the portals in a way that widen the perspectives that are involved and call into question things that might have taken much longer to call into question. I don't think it's coincidence that some of the movements we've seen around this country really picked up steam as a result of internet and mobile technology. So there's a give and take as far as I can see with the impact.
I'll also add that it creates a system of transparency for reporters per se, because people have in their power a way of actually verifying what is it that we're doing, I mean, and they can communicate directly with us and say, you should look at this in particular. And now we will report on what people want us to report and not necessarily what the journalists thought that was supposed to report.
Do you solicit that at the Inquirer? How do you hear that voice of the reader or the viewer or whatever? In
my case, I have been in the Latino communities bit for 6 months, which is the time that I've been with the newspaper. And in my case, this is a new beat. So it's completely developed from zero in the sense of as a beat for the newsroom. So I've been connecting with community organizers, community leaders, nonprofit executives, and locals from the different Latino perspectives or subgroups to be able to get their insights. First on what has the Philadelphia Inquirer been reporting that you consider that it has been good and what has been bad. What do you understand that we should be reporting more of? And what is it that you expect from a reporter that is covering the Latino community?
Well, are their expectations low because do they feel like they've been ignored?
They feel that we should do a more fair and responsible reporting about the communities. And that's exactly why the Philadelphia Inquirer created this Latino Communities Beat with the Lenfest Fellowship specifically. So that's the interest that we have right now, and that's why we're here.
Good. I don't know, there was a story recently on NPR in which the activist and journalist Shaun King said that he and a friend were reviving Frederick Douglass's anti-slavery newspaper, The North Star. And in the interview, King said, "There is this spirit in journalism to tell both sides of the story and to just let the listeners choose what they want to choose." I mean, I know when I was in journalism, that was certainly the principle we went by. And King continued, "And I understand that, and there's a place for it, but on some issues, we really do need to take a stand. What do you guys think about that? Jim, how about?
Well, there are a lot of ways to look at that. I mean, the first trap you can step into is false equivalency. Just because there are two sides to a story, it doesn't mean they're equally legitimate. One of the ways that going back to the Society of Professional Journalists, they say it's important to represent all sides of the story, all of the voices in the story, no matter how repugnant. So on one hand, we have to cover how repugnant you might find it, and so we have to address all of the stakeholders, all of the sources, all of the influencers, but that doesn't mean that we have to give them equal ground. Another issue that comes to mind is it depends on the topic. There are some issues where there is no counter-argument. If you care about health or peace or justice, nobody thinks that more people should be sick. But if you talk about, say, gun violence, for example, nobody thinks that more people should be injured, but not everybody agrees that the solution is to take away the guns or something else. So it's a matter of how you frame the topic and maybe what the topic is to begin with.
Let me press you a bit on something you said about how you have to talk with all sides in a story. Why? Why talk with the pedophile?
Well, right. So talk about repugnance, right? So it's extremely difficult, and while I haven't been to quite that level, I've had to come pretty close. And
can you give an example of that?
You know, I'm reluctant to reveal my position, but I guess I could name the topic without doing so. Yeah, it's when covering conflict around abortion or reproductive rights, or and we even give it away by what we call it. You know, in the gun debate, more often people concerned with gun violence prevention talk about guns, while people more concerned with defending their Second Amendment rights talk about firearms. So language matters as well. But the question of how, what was the question about how to cover people that you have a hard time? Did you find repugnant?
All those voices, even the ones, even the ones that you find repugnant.
Why is it important? It's important for context. How do you know where you stand? How do you consider the argument of a person you might agree with if you don't understand the counter-argument?
Absolutely. Even when you ask the question about the pedophile, I think if we understand what that particular pedophile's motivation or understanding is about what they've done and how they've impacted people, it may help. In the same way that I find racism repugnant, and I'm going to talk to and have talked with, for example, may he rest in peace, Jesse Helms, because people needed to know where he was coming from. I think it is important to include those voices.
So how thin is the line between news gathering, as we all think of it, and advocacy? I mean, you've worked for the TV station and as a journalist, and then you are working now on kind of the other side as the communications director for the police department. So what's the line that you see from both perspectives?
So what's interesting is I don't necessarily see it as the other side. I think
that gives away one of my biases.
Yes, I think that communication can connect or it can divide, and I tend to approach it from the connect portion and inform and whatnot. So if the question is how do I discern the line, well, I always respect the boundaries that I've agreed to work in. So if there is information that I may have access to in the police department, for example, that is not yet ready for public consumption for various reasons, whether I agree with those reasons or not, I understand why they think that's important. I won't necessarily share that. So, but I may advocate inside for sharing some of that for these reasons. Let's consider this when we think about whether or not we're going to release that person's name at this point, for example. So, and then with journalism, the line was always moving. The line was always moving. Right. You know, if there's a young person who's charged with a crime, generally my answer is no, I'm not using the young person's identity in a way that would identify that person. Even when we were dealing with capital crimes, and that meant if a young person a juvenile was charged with a capital crime, the accepted way of dealing with it was sharing their name and their face. I lost a little sleep over that just because of the way the brain develops, but I respect the line that I agreed to respect when I signed up for it.
Jesenia, do you see a thin line in advocacy, especially when you're covering people who might, you know, if you really bore down on the community from Dominican Republic? Is it hard sometimes not to advocate?
It's a tough question, because when you come from a background, you tend to have that spirit, that passion, and us Latinos, we are always passionate of everything that has to do with us. But there is a line that you draw it when you take yourself out of that context and you look at them in a frame as the community per se, and you start asking questions if whatever you are reporting on this community is or not a bias that you have for yourself, and is or not what reality is for them. So I say that when you advocate is when you stop asking yourself those questions about what your community is about and what the reality is about, and you just stick with it. So that's where I more or less try to, let's say, dance around between one line and the other one.
And advocacy, we're talking about advocating for truth and truths, plural. So that kind of advocacy I see is okay. It's the line that crosses into activism that I think people need to declare if they do that. I have seen reporters, plural, I have seen reporters carry a sign in a protest and then write the story for it and not declare that they were in the protest. That's problematic. But if they were advocating for the truths, that's different than the activism.
Yeah, but that you bring up a tricky thing in this political climate today, and the whole notion of a blurred truth, that there is no one.
Truths, plural.
Well,
is my
what
approach.
happens when truths collide?
Then they do. I trust my viewers, readers, to figure out that collision, like you talked about, people, the criticism there that people can just make up their minds. But I trust that they will figure that collision out. And what collides for me may not be what collides for you.
Jim, do you have thoughts on that? You look like you do.
Oh, way too many. So but I think an anecdote might sum it up pretty well, which was that around 2002 or so, there was an editor of one of the two alt weeklies in Philadelphia at the time who I'd known for some time. And I found him, I was covering a demonstration against the upcoming war in Iraq, the impending war in Iraq, and there he was carrying a sign. And I said, what are you doing? That's blasphemy. We journalists don't do this. And he said, these are different times, and it calls for a different response. And I said, I said, no, these are different times, and it calls for more deliberate adherence to our ethics. And we disagreed. 15 years later, I've got to tell you that I'm not carrying signs in demonstrations, but I feel what he's saying more than I did then. So I've changed, journalism changed, but times have changed.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it used to be a canon of journalism, and maybe it still is and still should be, you could argue, that you didn't get involved in politics at all. So I never gave to a candidate. I never got involved in any special interests, even when I was on the editorial board, and my opinions were well known on issues, or at least known on issues. So when I stopped being a journalist in 2014, I decided finally I was going to give money to a candidate. And I gave it to my elementary school buddy, Marty Gelfand, who was running for councilman in a Cleveland suburb. And that's who I gave my money. And boy, was it uncomfortable. I mean, I'm not sure if people realize how much journalists try to be, it gets us back to the whole notion of objectivity and subjectivity. Is that a good thing? Are we giving up part of our role in democracy even as we fulfill a different role in democracy?
I don't know. I don't think we are. Bayard Rustin didn't. And he covered King up close, and he covered stories in ways that they would not have been covered. And I see his journalism as advocacy journalism. Advocacy for one of the truths that was so marginalized that most people didn't get to hear that part of the story very well. And he still got to vote if he chose to or not. So I don't think we give up that
Jim,
part of our lives.
You're involved in Broke Philly and what was the other one? The
Reentry Project.
The Reentry Project, thank you. I mean, what is the role of community journalism now? It feels like there's a big niche to fill, and community journalism serves a huge purpose.
Sure, there are a lot, and there are
community media, we should say.
There are so many aspects to every question you're asking.
Yeah, well,
so if I were to pick one, I think what's changed when, at least in my experience, from once working for larger news organizations and now working for several community journalism projects, is that we're more responsive to the community because we better understand our responsibility, our impact on them, the way we affect them, and the way when we engage the people that we report on, and the ways that we portray them individually and as a group, and how that affects the other consumers in the community. Within the, while we're at it, another interesting thing that's happening with, so I was working on the reentry project and Brooke Philly in my role at Temple until very recently.
Right.
And they're both solutions-oriented projects that are based, so the definition of solutions journalism is reporting on evidence-based responses to social problems.
Mm-hmm.
So we're listening to communities and these, so I guess what I'm saying is community journalism and solutions go together very well.
Right.
And so we're listening to them rather than, you know, until a decade or 15 years ago, journalists kind of tied up their reporting at the end of the day, you know, in a big ribbon and said, here's what we know. And now we say, we do some reporting and say, here's what we know, what do you know? And we can, you know, continue working together. It's more collaborative.
Yeah, I think community journalism is a big reminder that the people we are covering are actually the experts themselves
Yes.
on these issues, and that we need to listen to them, we need to solicit their ideas, their opinions, their participation.
Exactly.
So we have a few minutes left, and I wanted to ask you guys to be prognosticators a bit, and what you see as challenges that lie ahead for both consumers of media and also for you as journalists.
Well, as producer of news, I think we have to have a more open international perspective of reporting for audiences that speak more than just English and that have multicultural backgrounds. And as consumers of news, I expect that people hold us more accountable every single day.
Do you get that sense in the work you've been doing?
Yes.
That is, you're building that relationship?
And that is good.
Denise?
I think establishing ways for people to determine whether they trust the sources of their information will be critical, so that people will be able to make good decisions about how they're going to act, how they won't act, so that people won't pick up a gun and go to a restaurant in Washington, D.C. where they think children are being held hostage because they weren't able to discern that the source of that information was baloney.
Right. And how do you do that? How do journalists in this day and age do that, especially with the political backdrop we see?
I'm not yet sure. I know that Rod Hicks has got a job with, I think it's SPJ, trying to help people discern, first trying to gauge where the problems lie in understanding what good sources are and where the problems lie with journalists and the way journalists are reporting. So I'm kind of waiting to hear from these folks who are now going into that area of really looking at this divide or this challenge and come up with some solutions. Because I don't know, other than continuing to show up honestly and openly and in the ways that we've talked about, that's one way, but I don't know the answer yet because there are far too many portals.
Are we transparent enough, Jim?
Oh my, we're right back to where we started. Well, it depends who are we. That leads to questions of, you know, what's journalism? Am I transparent enough? I do my best. I think that's the only choice we have that gives us integrity. And you know, in terms of, you know, what's happening next, when I look ahead, I think, as I said earlier, I think journalists are going to be held, it came up a couple of times, journalists are going to be held more accountable, I think specifically when covering traumatic events and the way that we affect the people that we cover. If people have been traumatized and we don't treat them appropriately, we can do more harm. In terms of what the challenges facing consumers, in terms of deciphering what news they can trust, they're also going to have fewer sources to turn to as the industry struggles economically. There's just going to be less trustworthy the news to work with.
So you think even it feels like it's burgeoning, but you're saying it's shrinking? You know,
so there are a lot of things. There are a lot of moving parts, and so I'd say yes. So the traditional industry adhering to those really strict values is shrinking. I think the overall ecosystem is growing almost explosively and brings a lot of other value, but maybe not the same authority, or maybe at the same time.
So we have come up with lots of solutions, and we haven't.
We've got as many questions as answers, right?
Exactly.
If not
I think
more.
that's
Is
true.
that always the way it is?
Well, I think we're out of time, so I think we've come full circle. I really thank you greatly for the conversation. It's been terrific, and I hope we can get together to continue it either on camera or off.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much, and this has been PhillyCAM Voices.